those of you who were at last night's event. My name is Connie Hale. I teach poetry here at Fresno State. And welcome to Together We'll Be a Song. I have a few items of information before we get started with the first panel. This will be the room for all of the panels today. Hopefully some of them will be really filled up, so come early, grab a seat. There's water over here. There might end up being snacks over here later in the afternoon. I'm not sure. All of our Saturday events will be here in the Henry Madden Library, but please feel free to wander. The campus is a wonderful place to explore. You can stretch your legs, take a walk, and it looks like the weather's going to be beautiful all day. Other spaces here in the library you want to make time for are the symposium headquarters if you haven't stopped by there already. You can get answers there to any questions you might have. You can also pick up some snacks, some coffee, a little name pad. You can get one yet, free literary journal while they last. And it's room 2108, right near the Starbucks. But our coffee's free. The other place you really don't want to miss is the Laureate Lab Visual Works Studio. It's room 1110 down on the first floor, right around the corner from the circulation desk. That is a collaboration. It's an amazing creative space, actually. It's a collaboration between the library and former U.S. Poet Laureate Juan Felipe Herrera. It will be open from 11 to 3 today, and it's staffed by MFA student Crystal Cantu, and she'll work with other members of the Laureate Lab crew. They have a lot of activities arranged, so stop in there. You can look at copies of the old Chicano Writers and Artists Association magazines. You can look at a copy of Andres' MFA thesis if you'd like to. It's checked out in my name, so don't spell copy on it. And there are poetry and art activities. Everyone's welcome to participate. So check that out. The third drop-in space is the Philip Levine Reading Room, and it's on this floor, sort of over in the back corner. If you go over to the metal stairs and all the way back. And it's just this lovely space with Philip Levine's private library housed in it, and it looks out on our Peace Garden, and it's a nice place if you just want to break to think, read and write, chat with friends, whatever. It's reserved for our conference all day today. So, our first panel is Poetics, responding to the poems of Andres Montoya. And the description is this: Montoya's poems leave a lasting emotional impact, as only powerful truth-telling can do on his readers. At the same time, these poems contribute significantly to the larger literary and cultural conversation. Our panelists will offer a variety of expert, critical, craft-focused, and personal responses. One unfortunate note, the wonderful Anthony Cody is unable to be with us today due to an injured shoulder. He's okay, but he just couldn't play from Chicago this week. So we miss him and wish him a speedy recovery. I'll serve as moderator, and I'll just simply introduce you really briefly to everybody on the panel, and then we'll get right into it. I think we'll probably just go in order of how they're saying. So Ronald Zurigan is a terrific painter as well as a poet and one of our wonderful MFA graduates whose first book, Rough Fire, is coming out from Finishing Line Press this summer. Stephanie Feta, I'm not going in order. Stephanie Feta is assistant professor of English at Syracuse University. She wrote the brilliant introduction to A Jury of Trees and has a monograph coming out next fall from Ohio University that has an entire chapter devoted to the work of Andres Montoya. Sarah Borjas is a Fresno native and Fresno State alum who now teaches at UC Riverside, and his first book of poems, We Are Too Big for This House, is due out from Noemi Press in 2018. Sarah Chavez is a Fresno native also and Fresno State alum who now teaches at Marshall University and whose powerful book of poems, Hands That Break and Scar, just came out from Sundress Publications in 2017. For more information on these folks, look in your program, or Google them, or ask them questions. So I think what we'll do, just start with Ronald, and we'll just go down the line. Each person will give a little talk, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Ron.
If I just do this, do I have to make sure that Jefferson said I should turn them on?
This on.
If you push the button on the bottom now, hold it until it goes to the light turns green. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. First, I have to say what an honor it is to be a part of this. I had the good fortune to know Andres, and I never would imagine that I would be here doing this talk today. Revisiting his poems was an emotional experience, to say the least. He was such an incredible influence on me. So I need to read this. I'm not going to be good free-forming this. So here it goes. Beyond qualities of sound, syntax, rhythm, and music, a good poem should offer two gifts to the listener or reader. One, the thing that is on the page, the honest and clear description, implied knowledge, and or the search for new knowledge. And two, the thing that is under words, the unknown purpose of the speaker that we as readers are free to interpret or uncover, the suggested understatements. I'm not alone in this, but my favorite poems are poems that exhibit these elements. They are not obvious, nor are they too complicated or elevated for us to understand or relate to. They ride that fine line and offer us, the readers, both gifts. The work of Andres Montoya is never void of these two things. His candor rules supreme. His search and purpose are both constantly clear, while we, the readers, are offered an opportunity to discover what we will on our own. Now, if I were, this is going to sound like a little bit biased, I think, but if I were forced to designate a particular voice for Fresno, or to represent the energy off-gassed by this entire valley, its urban and rural landscapes alike, Montoya's voice would be it. Other writers, of course, have achieved multitudes when speaking and writing about this valley. However, his voice seems to capture a crucial thing that others cannot, no matter how hard we try. I steal a line from James Wright's poem, A Blessing, to help me find words for this particular thing. In his poem, Wright describes two horses and states, "There is no loneliness like theirs." Montoya captures the singular, unique loneliness of the valley and her towns. A loneliness that only those who live here already understand. But Montoya shares this feeling openly with all of his readers. He's honest about the difficulties and beauty of this valley. Both in his speaker's voice, both of these in his speaker's voice are of equal import. So there's no loneliness like this. He's able to articulate this loneliness in a way that outsiders can understand as well. It allows outsiders to see eye to eye, or to feel like they could be here too. His is not only the voice of the lone walker who draws a path through this valley, he owns it, passes through, and yet never exits. This is a repeated theme in his poems. He loved to walk. The first two stanzas of his poem, Starstruck, from The Ice Worker Sings, can serve as an example of his ability to articulate this feeling through description. I'm going to read these first two stanzas. I would step out into the night, into the alley, where the ants savored the crushed anguish of a peach. was nothing but dirt with worm tracks of tires, 2 arms reaching to the place I'd always wanted to go. There is both a yearning here to get away, while also understanding that he must stay. His verse carries a particular sadness with which all readers of poetry may be familiar, and what most writers of poetry unsuccessfully try to capture without sounding silly. Lee Young Lee believes that there are 4 selves that must align in order for a poem to ascend. He describes these 4 selves as the social, which is what people see of us; the private, which our family and friends encounter from us; the secret, which is our internal monologue, which we don't share with people; and the unknown, which is the undescribable connection to something else, something spiritual. A kind of longing like Montoya's, which embodies an understanding of impermanence, or maybe just a fear of and expectance of death, is perhaps alive in the 4th self, I think, for all of us. The unknown self that Lee acknowledges may represent what we long for, yet our other selves cannot see it. Montoya again touches on this in the excerpt from Pierre, found in section 3 of A Jury of Trees. I'm going to read again the first 2 stanzas, stanzas of this poem. Who conceived your craters, or the slender bend of your knee? What are the grapevines winding their way under your skin, attempting to say? This longing, this sadness, this understanding of impermanence, and faith in a higher power through Montoya is translated as an element and unveiling of the 4th self, embedded in the soil of this valley, and unearthed through language and in the singing of his poems. His poems carry the songs sung within the bodies of grapes picked by our sisters, bricks laid by our uncles, earth tilled by our mothers and fathers, stories sung by our grandfathers, silences behind our grandmother's eyes. That's it for my portion. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for making it so early. And I have to agree and acknowledge what an honor it is to be here, to have you all here. We can't say enough what it is to have something like this. When I was asked to be part of this panel, one idea kind of wrenched itself up. And of course, I try to think about the things to speak about, but it kept calling me back. And so I think Montoya has made some space for us to have conversations not about his poetics, but our own poetics, lineage, and what we do with it. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about that, and also I'm going to need to read this, so bear with me. I want to start by sharing the lines of a poem that I really love called The Gate by Mary Howe. And in it, the speaker admits she lives in a space her brother has made for her in his own life before dying at an early age. These are the last lines. This is what you have been waiting for, he used to say to me. And I'd say, what? And he'd say, this, holding up my cheese and mustard sandwich. And I'd say, what? And he'd say, this, sort of looking around. And today, we find ourselves in a space that Andres made and left for us. looking around, gathered to honor the spirit of Andres Montoya. This is what Chicanx poetics have been waiting for, and what the canon never saw coming. It's true. Montoya is a crucial figure whose work eliminates Fresno and the Chicanx spirit. It was poetry's loss to not have his book in the people's hands, especially young Chicanx poets, before his death. But it is a gift that the Ice Worker sings exists. And it is now also our responsibility to take care of it. This symposium presents the opportunity to have a larger literary and cultural conversation about how we handle the legacy of Andres Montoya and our lineage. It's true that I found out about Montoya really late in my life. It wasn't until 2014 when I applied for the Andres Montoya Prize and was a finalist that I actually learned who he was and read his poems. I did not even read them in their entirety until much later. I did not inherit his poetics the same way others have, but we are undoubtedly blood. When I read his lines about poetry scrawled on a wall in Pinedale, where my family is from, or the crushed anguish of a peach, my experience is instantly poetic material, just as it is. I imagine we all live clinging to the same long leg of the 99. We all know well the work of Roque Dalton and Leanne Lee. We all express our ambivalent nature to be romantic while saying romantic things. We all feel we don't know enough to say anything. What Andres' work gives me is access to my own language and the confidence to call it poetry. His lines have become a kind of door for my own poetry, especially in my head, which is a crucial and sometimes hazardous place for poets of color living in a world of with the daily threats of racism and discrimination. Andres writes in a poem to his father, "I came here looking for you, an image, a ghost, something I could crawl into and imitate." And while I find myself doing that same thing with his poems, the reality is I'm already so far into myself. By the time I read The Ice Worker Sings, I had already written a manuscript. Not that it was good, but it was there. And I wonder, what does that mean for me as a Fresno Chicana poet, if the genealogy does not trace back? If his influence on me started late, and that reading of his work is considered a prerequisite for belonging. While writing this for today, I at times felt illegitimate and bastardized in a way. His tangible absence from my sensibilities, of which I cannot stake on any one source or person, including myself, though I clearly had not done my homework. This does not determine the depth and direction of my honor and admiration for his spirit and work. I must admit, often, and unfortunately, I have had a Chicana poet attempt to explain to me the importance of Montoya's poetry to my own identity as a Chicanx Fresno poet, or seem to want to teach me, with the fervor of a poet and the best intentions, a small history lesson on my own poetics, which is our shared blood. These moments have left me feeling distance, and I've always worked against my personal emotional response to Andres' poetry. My relationship to the dust, to the motels, to the place Montoya wrote about is different from my Chicanx brothers. Different, but no less deep. I have legitimate desires for Fresno poetry and for Chicanx poetry, but they are not masculine, and they are not characterized by a working class aesthetic. They defy the type of categorization that minimizes complexity or erases. They embrace the humbleness exemplified by Andres in his own poems. They stretch the definitions of poetry, romanticism, and what it means to be Chicanx. This sentiment is common amongst women poets in Fresno and Chicana poets. We have had the conversation amongst ourselves and do often. But as Andres himself says in the poem, silence. It wounds me, this silence. And though my wounds like coins are nothing, though I lose them and find them again, it is still true, this silence wounds us all. And as Daniel Chacon says in the foreword of Jury of Trees, whatever meaning we give to the life of a dead person is filtered through our own needs and desires. Andres belongs to us now, our common literary heritage. And so, following this thought, I think our relationship to Andres' work sparks a conversation that needs to happen and eventually become unnecessary in our community about the canon of Chicanx poetry and Fresno poetry and the possessiveness we sometimes practice. It's dangerous because it leaves many Chicana and women poets out, or it commits us to the student seat. Montoya's poetry and life has become a door for our poetics. But who hears the noise of it creaking open? What is transformative about poetry is the conversations poems allow us to have with ourselves and with the people we love. I have legitimate desires for Fresno and Chicanx poetry. They include spaces where men and women are equally represented, where there are more questions and curiosities than explanations, where we hold each other accountable and ourselves accountable in the name of love and longevity. Who are we if we aren't critical of the people we love? If we can't nurture the trust that is crucial to the health of a community? We are here because we are shaped and reshaped by Montoya's poetry. The meaning in our lives is ineffable, bone deep, in the dusty air we all breathe. So we are here to handle his poetry as a community, and this is what I believe gives meaning to his poetic life. Here we are, looking around, our hearts bowed. The power of his illuminating position in Chicanx and Fresno poetics depends on what we do with it. We have the opportunity to enrich his legacy, which is all of ours. This is what we have been waiting for. Thank you.
Good morning. I wanted to say thank you again to all of you, and particularly to Connie Hales for inviting me, which I really appreciate. I'm from here, and any excuse to come back is a good excuse, and I could not think of a better one than this, frankly. I am also going to read. I have a terrible title for this. It's really bad, so I'm just kidding. I was going to ask for suggestions, and I'm like, oh no, that's not a good way to start. When Andres Montoya died in 1999, I had just graduated from San Joaquin Memorial High School, a scholarship kid from West Fresno who worked at the school as a janitor after volleyball practice and as maintenance 2 summers before graduation. The only kid in the school who worked on someone's family's farm as a laborer and not the lazy brat kid of the owner. When I enrolled at Fresno State, I didn't know to go to orientation. I didn't have an advisor. I just knew that I wanted to be better, to do better for myself, and I thought that meant getting a white-collar job, which required a degree. But I loved art, and I loved reading. Reading and writing in a battered red spiral notebook had gotten me through the common teen angsts of love and betrayal, through teasing and exclusion, through sexual harassment and the deaths of so many friends. My first semester, I took a drawing class, my second, a poetry workshop. Sadly, I do not remember that professor's name, some dolled up, newly graduated MFA, feeling insecure about her place in the literary world. At least that's what I understand her rigidity to me now that I've been in the same position. While I don't remember her or that class particularly fondly, I owe it my desire to keep taking writing classes, to say to myself, this is meaningful, and I can do this and study psychology or sociology or whatever I thought was going to make me money. None. The poetry workshops that do remain clear in my mind are those that I took with Charles Hanslashak, including periodic workshop visits from Philip Levine, Ruth Schwartz, and Dr. Connie Hales. It was in those classes that I read a variety of living writers, writers of color, and met other young poets with much clearer motivation than I had, like James Tyner and Michael Madrono. When as a senior and an English major, I changed over in my junior year, I joined Cockroaches, Flies, and Poets as a poetry editor, and I didn't know that Andres Montoya was co-founder of the Chicano Writers and Artists Association, but I did know the book, The Ice Worker Sings, and other poems. I had read and reread those 79 pages of poetry with special attention to the Ice Worker poems. Up to that point, I hadn't read poetry that discussed Fresno so closely to what I saw growing up. I had never read a depiction so loving while simultaneously pointing out the deep flaws in the infrastructure, the poverty, the street gangs, the need for social justice. These poems moved me, but they did not transcend me. They did not go over, float out of, or outgrow the reality of the city. That is what made them so magical, their determination to remain booted feet on Blackstone. In one of my subsequent post-college moves, I lost that tenderly worn copy of The Ice Worker Sings. Getting a new copy recently, rereading those poems with older, more experienced eyes, I was struck by how very much Montoya's influence had remained with me. How much his affection for the valley where the city had colored my own. I couldn't see Fresno clearly before I left, but 2,000 miles of space allowed me to, quote, love the asphalt, the cracks and dust. That space provided me the ability to describe the dirt and grit, the unique clash of economic circumstances shifting block to block. I began to write my own version of the city, my own experiences of violence and death, of work and the working classes. My work was not the fields or tire factories of Gary Soto or the Detroit job lines of Philip Levine, two writers also intensely influential to me and to Montoya, but of serving tables and throwing espresso shots or painting classrooms, being the lightest on the maintenance crew, so the one who had to climb onto the roof of the broom to get debris off. In poems, I sketched the outline of co-workers and found peace in practical purpose. I was almost embarrassed rereading The Ice Worker Sings for the most recent second and third time. Montoya's poems had infiltrated my brain and heart so deeply, I found that in the stretch of years I had been writing through the forms of worker persona, of the epistle, the vernacular-laced plain language, staples in Montoya's work. It was all there in my poems, an unwitting homage to my predecessor. While my focus on work and my focus in regards to work became about community survival and bodily safety, the Ice Worker poems frame work as a space for survival of the soul. Survival of the soul and moments of quiet and self-reflection to understand one's own artistic voice when away from the neighborhood din. In the title poem, The Ice Worker Sings, the speaker states, he liked his job because they let him alone. Here, everyone wore earplugs, and he was left in a room by himself. He found himself, singing songs he never knew he loved, sometimes a rock or blues or even classical tune. He would steal the beats and put in his own words about life, about love, about dying. This is how he became a poet. This poem, as the title poem in particular, marks the collection as a Künstlerroman, an artist's coming of age or of spirit narrative. The setting of the ice plant as a place of labor where the ice worker can, quote, stack blocks into rows of crystal perfection is a necessary isolation from the potholes and gravel and dust and heat of the valley. There, the ice worker participates in the necessary commodification of the body's movements while pretending he's in charge of an ice army. But rather than falling into the too-oft trap of Chicano machismo, the ice worker is merely attempting to create a space where he is safe to laugh and cry and sing. Those outpourings of emotion indicative of the poet Philip Larkin's pleasure principle, where he argues that all good poetry must begin with a man obsessed with an emotional concept to such a degree that he is compelled to do something about it. The ice worker's emotions are released in the moments where the body's movement frees the mind and spirit, and the rest of the collection is Montoya doing something to communicate the simultaneous complexity and simplicity of life in this harsh, beautiful place. While the collection overall, like much of Chicanx Latinx poetry of the 1990s and earlier, is deceptively accessible, with line structures that generate music and their simplicity, these poems are woven with complicated concepts of guilt, life lust, breaks in perception, political subject positions, the construction of race and ethnicity, and questioning of overwrought performances of masculinity. My privilege in coming to these poems early in my life is that I was shown that the narratives of my community were of poetic value. I didn't have to write pastorals about loam and oak trees. I could, seriously, so many long poems. I could write about busted streetlights, about syringes in the gutter, about children climbing into industrial garbage bins to pull out building materials to play with. My perception of poetry widened, and I realized I didn't have to become someone else to fit into it. Thank you.
So I don't have a microphone, but I think everyone can hear me. Okay, so we're going to try this in PowerPoint. I also would think we had to do so many things at once. Oh, okay, well, I guess I will. All right, let's see how this works. Okay, so I want to thank you too, Connie and Francisco, for organizing this incredible conference. It was such an honor to be asked for a critical introduction to Jury of Trees, and it's equally honorable or an honor to be here with you today and to see some old friends and new friends as well. I want to focus my remarks today on the role of the expressive body, what I refer to as the soma, the subject of my broader research that will appear in a monograph that will come out in late October this year. And here's my book cover. And I think this image is really important because it kind of just, visually describes what I'm reaching for with the term soma, and that directly helps me understand Andres' poetry. As we can see, this body is, this woman is sort of in a particular physical position that she could be ashamed, she could be depressed, and her body is sort of leaking out from the inside out in flames. And this is the kind of body, the kind of emotion that we feel that is actually precognitive. It happens before we actually understand what we're feeling, and we automatically respond to it in some sort of physical posture. So this concept actually has led me to see the spirituality in Andres' poetry. So this morning I'd like to share with you how the soma, the body expression of tears, laughter, grimaces, voices, gurgling, stutters, and sighs, the body that materially reflects most accurately how we feel. I bring up the Soma because the Soma brought me to understand the spiritual dimension of Andres' poetry that I proposed to you this morning. I was first introduced to his poetry when he won the first prize in the 1998 University of California Irvine Contest for Latino Literature, where I was a graduate student. Although I never met Andres, I was immediately taken by his poetry. I was struck by the spiritual love he expressed for people in delicate moments, nature in its everyday splendor, but also his capacity to write of love in difficult situations, including those times of abjection suffered by his community. I don't pretend with a poetic eye to sort of be Andres, although through reliable sources, I guess there's more of biographical Andres in his poetry than I originally thought. I have the wonderful, amazing fortune, I teach in Syracuse, New York, Central New York. I don't know if any of you've been there. It was a bit remote, and suddenly, Lakis and Leslie were coming to town. There's nothing Chicano ever. And here they were, and they were coming, we got to have dinner together while I was finishing my chapter of my book on Andres' poetry, so it's quite amazing. Over the years, while working on an analysis of his verse for the Chicano Latino Literary Prize Contest, the anthology I mentioned I was editing, as I read and reread the Ice Worker sayings, tears, my tears, reliable with each read, surprised me. To me, he sung his spirit and his anger, his disappointment, his sin in graphic marks. They in themselves empty signposts that nevertheless seem to point to something much greater. My tears responded to the portrayal of his hurt yet luminous spirit, and I realized my emotional response to his poetry was actually a beautiful gateway for scholarly engagement. Almost secretly, I was delighted to traverse prohibited zones of analysis. I was going to honor my emotions and paying close attention to particular signs, word choice, names, punctuation, of his spiritual message. Once I started to decipher clearly that Ice Worker Sings was a conversion narrative, I began noticing the collection was interwoven with the presence of Divine Sophia, the second deific figure in various Christian Orthodox faiths. And here's an image of her from Russia. It's a painting in a 16th century church. And you'll see that Sophia in the Old Testament, today in Orthodox Christian faith, sits at God's side, forming an alternate Holy Trinity made up of God, Sophia, and the Holy Spirit, as opposed to the more familiar Trinity of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Even more exciting than learning of a Christian female deity that anteceded Jesus was discovering how Andres wrote his conversion story and cultivated his Christian joy through what I believe to be Sophia's special theological attributes. Sophia works through all of human experience, good deeds, sin, generosity, and human treachery as moments for possible spiritual illumination. She is tied to sexuality and other human pleasures through which she potentiates a special power in the midst of carnal human experience. She appears through base emotions as they rise across the spectrum of life forms and earthly forces. Her effect can be seen in the soma of one suddenly illuminated with joy or serenity amid tears, loss, or even anger. Authors of the Old Testament called her sensuous power wisdom, always appearing with a capital W. And it is Sophia theology, or Sophiology as it's referred to, where physical and emotional sensations are sites and methods of divine inspiration, a deep and wise knowledge that was once appreciated through the body, and then was later forgotten when not repudiated in contemporary practices of Christianity. But Andres consciously cultivates the connection between his earthly delights and our darker drives, and does so specifically through lyricizing subjective powers of body parts. Here, I would rather show you what I mean than describe it. Last night, we heard poems inspired by what I call Andres' body parts, body poems. So we have the forehead, el ombligo, toes, piernas, etc., the face. But I offer you a poem from the Alchemia collection that also refers to the somatic body. Come and gather my eyeballs like fruit from a tree, and see the other cheek of the world. In this poem, eyeballs become objects to collect, a sensuous joy, abundant and generous. And where the fruit's random dispersal or maybe the tree's trunk becomes analogous for the other cheek of the world. Another softness and glory that lives beneath eyes, now bountiful and nourishing. I continue to feel Sophia's presence in his body, the side of sin, down to suffering and death, and at the same time, the joy of release. An enlightening experience found in various poems and jury retreats, but particularly in the Leukemia poems. A second poem. When I came into this nothing about conquest, but my cheeks understood everything, as if an ancestor had hidden himself beneath my skin. In the former, I noticed the role of the body in disorienting the figure into a heightened questioning, no longer as one driven by the mind for modern Western culture, but should consider each body part its own source of subjectivity. In the cheek, the forehead, or the toes, each part reflects its experience, partly as a recipient of the decisions made by the mind-driven self, but also as a life lived in itself and of itself. But the body part also refracts the environment in which it has lived. Sophia theologically ties the realm of human physicality as a sight and requalifies the innocuous cheek as a presence, an entity unto itself, capable of experiencing the divine. This dismantling of the body, or rather the reconfiguring of subjectivity per the body, gives voice to the deific figure of Sophia, who views the poetic's voice's leg, forehead, with a spiritual sensitivity of which the speaker mentally may not have been aware. The lives of the body, expressed in my term soma, become a point of departure from my study where, written in almost haiku fashion, the leukemia poems register the spiritual state of Andres as he prepared for death. One day, I asked God to stamp eternity on my eyes. I didn't know what I was saying. I only knew that I wanted to understand cheek bones and the hope of clouds. Generally composed of fewer lines than in many of his other poems, the body poems, like the leukemia poems, speak to a deep spiritual embrace of his circumstance. I can feel the weakness of his body in his poem's brevity, but his strength of spirit is evident when he presents such eloquence in so few lines. He writes and he is spiritually very much alive while he lay dying. The presence of God is very close by. He awaits God longingly, while present to the detritus of his physical state. Let me share these lines with you. Everything I see, hear, touch, feel, taste, speak, think, imagine, is completing a perfect circle God has drawn. Here he doesn't so much describe his spiritual beliefs as express his experience of God. Andres employs language to express not his theology, which would suppose some pedagogical aim and perhaps doctrinal implications, as much as presenting an enlivening aesthetic transcription of his spirituality. His direct approach to the spiritual transcendence of his physical experience, I believe, continues inspired by Sophia, potentiator of wisdom through sentience. Actually, I must confess, I've tricked you. The poem I just read is not written by Andres, but it seems like it could be. Why? Because Andres's poetry is of the mystic, a poet who uses language to transcend his state of flawed humanness for his experience of divine in its midst. The poem I just read was written by the famous Iranian mystic poet Jalaluddin Rumi in the 13th century. A title reserved for a small group of poets globally and across time, Andres's poetry projects a state of one in complete communion with God. As Daniel Chacon and family members have shared with me, Andres was boldly unafraid of dying, hardly a common experience. It seems to me he was also unafraid of living. In the entirety of his collection, while not all mystic poetry in my estimation, he exhibits his willingness to die to a mentality imprisoning him, a mentality and sociality brought on from social forces greater than him. Hegemonic evil, if you will, that in the forms of underemployment, discrimination, poverty, and racism, had poisoned the communal well. While he observes failings in himself and others, he spiritually arises like a phoenix, finding God in the crushed peach, in the travail of ants, and in the jury of trees. These moments are not separate from humanity, but occur in a spiritual continuum to which he gives direct and emphatic address. An article I have just begun to prepare, I leave you with the following poems to appreciate Andres's mystic book, Poem and Jury of Trees, where he sings on par with the greatest mystic poets of all time. From my breath I extract God, and my eye is a shop where I offer him to the world. So, who wrote this poem? Andres or Meister Eckhart, the German mystic from the 14th century? Not me for Andres. Not me for Meister Eckhart. It's Meister Eckhart, but you can see by the verses, the tone, the intention, how similar it is. Not in terms of content, there's no sort of imitation. It's the direction of the mystic poet. It is what a mystic poet does. And when you see it on Andres's words, you see that truly he is a mystic poet. I think we started that, and I plan on arguing. Okay, one last poem. Is this poem going to be written by
or Andres?
I do not understand the way an eye or a smile blooms like a rose with its breath on a warm night. How many say St. Francis of Assisi? How many say Andres? It is Andres, but you should read St. Francis of Assisi's words. You stop it. Seriously, I mean, there's such, it's so powerful. The connections are so powerful, and there's two primary mystic poets that I believe I'm most going to look at, and it's Rumi and St. Francis of Assisi, and all three actually Meister Eckhart as well. I look forward to another occasion to show the specificity of Andres' mysticism, but I believe comparing the poems yourselves makes evident the similarities in tone, direction, intention, and structure. These are not descriptions, but are palpably imbued with spirit. They are songs and prayer of the mystic. Thank you.
Thank you. Does this belong? So, that was wonderful, thank you all. Another big hand for our panelists. Any questions that you have for all or any of them? Yes.
Yeah, so Sada talked about like the canonization of Chicanx and Latinx poetry. And my question was like, how would we go about like creating that canon or talking about that canon and not paralleling the canon of Western poetry and Western literature that is very much based upon white men, specifically men. So how do we ensure that when we create a canon, or if there is a canon for Chicanx poetry, that it isn't like specifically based upon Chicano writers, Chicano with an O writers, men, you know, how do we ensure that it's not just the voices of men? Like how do we create a way to ensure that queer people, that women, that, you know, not just men are embedded in that canon? Or how would we even talk about creating that canon?
And that's something I thought about. It was coming, and I don't have like a specific like process yet, but I think it has to do with. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. I think it has to do with how we regard the nature of a canon, right? Because even though like Andres was very knowing, you know, like Stephanie is, you know, dropping profound knowledge upon us all in such small lines. I think that just always keeping in mind and reminding ourselves and reminding each other that the canon is a flexible, living, breathing thing. And I feel like if our heart is in that direction, however romantic that sounds, that's the thing that will guide us. I also think always keeping the invitations flowing from everywhere. And I know I get really comfortable in my own like poetry clique. You know, I have my friends that have my back and support me. But that started somewhere. And so just for me, always being flexible with who I'm tied to, who can love me, you know, and who I can love, even if they might not resonate with me at the beginning. Maybe it sounds a little like luxurious as far as the heart goes, but I think that's the thing I trust the most.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
I would love to. I think what you just said is not even romantic. It's a complete human necessity that we're bonded and that we love each other. And I think it's an extremely radical politic to think about forming a canon or any other kind of sort of endeavor, scholarly or otherwise, on that basis. So I just want to, I think we need to get rid of that language, that this is not a real project, both as human beings and as scholars. I don't know, I think it's so powerful. The other thing I was thinking though, I mean, talk about the canon, and we have the Western canon, and the United States canon as well, And, you know, then it becomes really, well, it becomes dicey on any front, right? But I too would like to think about with all of you, you know, how we might look at our own poetry in terms of American literature. You know, how do we want to situate ourselves? We're winning awards, and so that's great, and we get a wider distribution and more people know about our literature. But I think if there's any way that we can sort of help craft that relationship, you know, not just sort of let it happen, because you know what's going to happen. They're going to do what they're going to do with it. They're going to read it. I mean, what else they'll do is reduce to one line, right? Words gab and it's torn, right, and continues to bleed, and that's it. And her poetry is completely lost. Who looks at her poetry? No one. So I think that, I don't know, there's enough of us now, like a pretty prominent mass of scholars and artists and writers, etc. It would be wonderful to have that discussion, how to do it skillfully.
And I just want to add, like, on an incredibly practical and like maybe even overly simplistic level, Chicanas need to be taught more. Like, their work needs to be in classrooms, whether that's a community classroom or a community college classroom or a university classroom. Because, I mean, I didn't read Lorna de Cervantes until I was in grad school, and she you know, she literally lived not very far away. And that blows my mind in retrospect. And I think there's, and as someone who actually does really, like, Chicano poetry really does, like, speak to me, and especially in a sort of, like, working class aesthetic, but I feel like there needs to be more conversation happening between those two things, too, and a structured conversation about, like, here are how these things are working together, here is how certain Western educational forces have pushed Chicanas out of those spaces, and so it's like a bringing back in, but then also having a larger conversation so that we're not also throwing something out, right? Like, that ends up being the problem with the canon always, like, well, we only have 6 spots, so it's not Shakespeare, right? Like, I don't want that to be, I don't want that to be, like, our issue with, like, a Chicanx canon either. Like, there's, you know, Gloriads will do it, nothing thrust out, right? Like, multiplicities.
Other questions?
So, Stephanie, I really enjoyed your talk. It's nice to see you again. I want you to talk to us about the mystic as a mystic in the world. And most of the time, the mystics are people who want to transcend the world and make a connection to God, and then leave the physical behind and have the metaphysical be the presence, right? And in Montoya's poetry, I see that I totally agree with you, he's a mystic in the world, but he's not refuting the metaphysical, he's not refuting the physical, he's affirming the physical in order to unveil the metaphysical. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, you know, as I was reading that sentence out loud, I thought that it was not clear, this exact point, and the chapter I wrote in my monograph exactly argues this. Actually, I feel there is no transcendence, and I needed to catch that word differently in this paper. I think that's what's really amazing about him. He's a mystic poet, but offers no transcendence. None. No, he's going to die like this. There's an intimation of the poetic eye, making him continue to live in some of the ways that were, you know, less than whatever. You know, may have led a very full, colorful life. And so, to me, it seems that there's no intention of actually even changing external circumstances in terms of, like you said, is the manifestation of what living in hegemonic culture is. But that doesn't remove him. I think that's where the soma is so powerful. It doesn't remove him from this completely other sense and perception of that reality. That kind of, I wouldn't say it's continuous. There's moments in his poetry where he is that angry man. You know, there's not even a spiritual glimpse in them in many poems. And that's okay. It all works together. It makes it, you know, a mystic, Chicano mystic poet, right? It's like, it's very much Chicano in this sense. I hope I answered your question.
Others? No more questions?
you find yourself kind of coming up against the wall, or yeah, those ruptures in his work when it comes to how it resonates with you?
Who wants to start?
Or even maybe when it's like coming, like discussing it with others, or I feel like we were leading through conversations where, you know, it was contentious and you felt you had to back away.
Yeah. And I think, I'm trying to get like specific poems, but, and here's the problem, it's not the poems themselves for me, it's the way they're being, kind of like whittled down in the conversations that we're having. Being simplified, and that's what I butt up against is that simplification. And that's my worry is that, that's what I brought this because that's like a Eurocentric practice for us to not diminish the complexity of something that does maybe seem simple to the fact where, to a point where it can erase. And sometimes we're in that danger zone when we have a conversation. The poems themselves, I can hard to, you know, and that's why I feel confident having these conversations. But the poems themselves, yeah, they're immediate. They're like they're in it. So I don't know what anybody else has.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in terms of having, like you said, like in terms of the discussion, right?
It's a discussion.
I think that in terms of teaching and talking about this tension between honoring like women's experiences as well, there are certainly, I haven't taught his poems as much. There are some writers that I'm like, I'm gonna take this in the classroom and it's gonna make me sad when someone says something weird. So I have to like steal before I bring certain things in. But in some conversations I've had in smaller groups, like the representation of women as like foils for certain types of emotional responses. I think I'm thinking specifically of I'm gonna get the title wrong, but it's like the ice worker falls in love. Yeah, and on so many levels, I like that poem on so many levels, but having a sort of 2018 conversation about the commodification of women's bodies and women's bodies standing in as moments of spiritual connection, but also like it's so complicated, and that's the thing that I think makes this work so rich is, and that's what I meant by like deceptively accessible, because there's so many complicated ideas going on, but there's that immediately like, oh, I can feel this, but then like I'm thinking about it more and I'm like, oh wow, like this is complex, and the representation of like relationships with women. I mean, there's a lot about like violence against women in the poetry because that was happening and that was real and it is still very real. But I think that it'd be interesting to complicate that within the larger context of like Chicanx poetry and Valley poetry too.
I'm just in awe over here, yes.
Just to second that, I mean, I think that, you know, just the use of the word war is problematic, and the way that it's used in order to talk about something else. For me, obviously, as I've already said, Sophia is this really incredible figure, and in that poem, Ice Worker Love, she, you know, first she's Alex, and then she reveals herself as Sophia. That's how I figured this out. Yeah, like, that's where I came up with Sophia at all, and I thought, and then I learned more about Sophia, and I thought, who was Sophia, and then it was just really amazing how it all rolled out for me. It was just this whole like spiritual process and aesthetic process myself. But that doesn't lessen the fact that this kind of treatment is found throughout in terms of teaching as well, like Papagelas is pretty difficult, especially for a student body or my institution that's made up of half, ultra-rich white kids, and then you've got Latinos, no Chicanos hardly ever, Latinos from the inner city, and then you've got Puerto Ricans from the islands who tend to be very wealthy, and then the occasional African-American or Asian-American student. So, to move them from this part of Papagelas where he talks about Shakespeare and experience of reading Shakespeare, it reminds me of Richard Rodriguez's, I think that's the chapter's called The Library or something. Yeah, where he's saying, what is it to read, these great works of literature when I'm nowhere, and I have to assume this other position of self that I can possibly embody, and sort of the violence that's done to me. And Andres touches this point too, and he brings up, I think it's somebody who's on the street who cooks some kind of street food or something as an object of worthy, of beauty, real beauty. But for my students to try and understand that, I mean, talk about painful embracing yourself. So I think those are moments when it is difficult. And just, I think really, he said his voice is so particular to a set of experiences that if I weren't me, and we weren't us, I don't know what that would be like to try and read his poetry. I mean, how would you feel in all those gaps? But we do it for other works all the time, right? And we're asked to stretch in these ways, so, too bad in a sense.
I do also something I want to add that, in asking this, and I've been having a contentious conversation, and I understand that when I'm asking people I care about to see themselves or hold themselves accountable and let me do that too, I also have to acknowledge that we all are participating in a system of patriarchy, of racism, sexism, discrimination. So for me to say, hey, but you're a woke poet, so don't, that's impossible for me to ask anybody to transcend those systems. And I know that. And that's the reason why I say if we love somebody, we have to be critical and make them better and make ourselves better. But I don't for 1 second pretend that that is easy, or pretend that there are not forces that are bigger than us that are making it impossible for us. But that's why we've got to stay tight.
And I just want to throw out there a comment back on the canon. It's interesting to me. I'm also an educator, and who we can't bring into the classroom. Isn't that an issue of the learning canon as well? And these oppressive systems that we won't teach certain individuals because we don't trust that the students are able to handle it. And that's a problem. And I see myself doing that as well. I mean, that is a problem. If we, as Latinx writers and teachers, cannot bring them into the classroom, who can? And what is stopping us? I mean, I guess that would be a question for me, for all of us, is that I do this too. Why am I not teaching? Why am I not teaching? What is that? Those larger broken systems that of repression that is really sitting inside all of us.
This is transitioning nicely into our next panel about teaching. Are there any other questions? We've got time for one more.
I have one more.
Okay.
If nobody else does.
Go ahead. I don't see anybody else.
Okay. So I had to reword this like 5 times. Okay. So my question is kind of like, how important is it to like acknowledge the context of like current events and the social climate, and specifically our current geopolitical social context? And is that something that is always embedded in your poetry and in your work, and that you always have to acknowledge? And how do you acknowledge it?
So I have complicated feelings about that, but one thing that I personally do is write the narrative, like write the story. I think that you arguments like why people do not necessarily like this tact, but I think that is the sneaky way to like get in and make someone like truly think about what's going on, is to have that personal narrative there and to have someone personally connect, and then that's the thing that kind of like breaks in, you know, like kind of inviting someone in rather than this is terrible, this, you know, and there's a place for that too, right? Absolutely. But in the way I handle, at least in my poetry, I'm more like wanting to have, I want the person to stop to have the conversation to begin with, and so sometimes I prefer to come at those things sideways is the wrong like verb, but to put it in the body. Like I want to come back to the body every single time, because the politics are in the body, they're happening to the body, bodies are doing them, and so I think it's like really visceral in that sense. So that's my approach at least.
I was just gonna say, in terms of your comment about how to teach things, so I'm from here, well, Southern California. And even though I'm in New York in that sort of environment, I've taught Jerry Cheese to undergrads. And I just do it. And I figure, you know, we act as if we're kind of complicit in sort of a monoculturalism. You know, the hegemony wants us to believe that. But it's not actually true. So far, I haven't been to too many places where this is the fact, right? There are other people everywhere, and they are also influencing whatever's going on. So I like to think of it as an appeal to treating our multicultural society as multicultural. We're all translating, we're all deciphering constantly, whether we speak the same language or not. And through the Soma, we have incredible resonance or lack of resonance. So I think that we should start acting like, I don't translate words, you know, if I'm teaching something in English, I actually teach in the Spanish department, but anyway, if I'm teaching in English, no, you don't get it. You know, why are you pretending that you don't? So that's my position.
You know, and I also like to respond to your comment. I teach, so I think, I feel oftentimes like in a very vulnerable position when I'm teaching, because I'm a lecturer, I have no power or tenure, and I'm highly regarded or rehired based upon student evaluations. And so I'm scared to say things. And then when the majority of the teachers at universities are lecturers, and then we all feel that way, it's like, yeah, we made it, we did it, we're not really though, you know? And so I teach a class that's 175 students, it's a survey of contemporary poetry, and I'm always scared, I'm like, should I bring this in? But the reality is like, I can trust them more than I thought I could. I can trust them more, and when I've taken risks, like this last quarter, I mean, it shouldn't be a risk, it shouldn't be used in order now, it should just be a practice.
But it is a risk, and
But it is a
because
risk.
there's fear and it's a reality, those are the voices that we need to bring into the conversation and be very adamant about the voice is, why is this larger narrative making us scared? Like, how dare it, I'm tired of it.
And that's it, it's internal.
And it's that, I mean, like, I don't fault anybody for what they choose to learn curriculum, but I constantly ask myself, and try to hold myself to a standard in those oppressive systems. And it's the system that we need to really start chipping away at, because the canon, we are humans, we decide that. Tenure is a process we decide, break it down. The way we treat our teachers and the way we treat our communities, that is our choice. We have, in many ways, we have to ask for it. And I'm tired of not being heard.
Well, you know what, I read like Don't Call Us Dead, Dennis Smith, and then the next week we read White Papers by Martha Collins. And I try to bring a lot of poems by white poets and say, let's talk about whiteness. I'm not here to teach this is part of it. Let's decenter whiteness first, before you start talking about this, distilling this to a Black experience. And what I found is they really surprised me. And when I make the conversation about us as a community versus like me versus you, or white versus Black, or Chicano versus, you know, whatever, and holding accountable to each other, it goes a lot more smooth. And I'll have students the whole class, it's a huge class, and she's like, it's especially quiet in here. And I'm really curious, like, why we're quiet. If you don't know, I think something we all need to think about. And I get to hear shit. And I was like, what do you guys have to say? And so I think we can trust too, especially we can trust young poets of color, young students of color, and it's already in there. So, I don't know, it's worth trying. What are they gonna do, fire you? And then, so what? At least you got the people you did while you were there, you know? I don't know.
I hate to cut it off now, but I think we continue this conversation, which is a wonderful conversation to be having. The next, oh, you have something?
Just will you make your papers available to us, which you presented this morning?
We can talk about that.
I really would like that.
We'll talk about it and post if we can or can't, and maybe people who want to can make that possible. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again.